The first sound is not a scream. It is the clatter of chains dragging across frozen stone. Dawn has only just begun to bleed into the sky, but the town square is already awake, a dense, unmoving mass of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising in pale streams. The cold gnaws through wool and leather, but no one leaves, no one speaks, they simply wait. Two guards emerge from the narrow alley beside the apothecary, hauling a young woman between them. Her feet skid across the cobblestones, toes scraping against ice. Every staggered step leaves a smear of dirt behind her. She is little more than a silhouette at first, a thin figure wrapped in a tattered dress, the color of wet ash. But as the light stretches across the square, her face begins to resolve. She cannot be more than 20. She blinks hard, as if the world refuses to sharpen, as if waking would undo all of this. But the crowd is real, the platform is real, and the long vertical shadow cast across the boards in front of her, that is real too. The guards shove her forward. When she trips, the gasp that ripples across the square is not fear, not sympathy, it is anticipation, the tightening of a knot pulled by hundreds of unseen hands. The hook hangs above the platform like a verdict already delivered. It swings from a heavy beam, the iron darkened with age, its point curving upward in a deliberate, unnatural arch. It is the kind of shape no craftsman invents by accident, too thick for farm use, too smooth for simple butcher's tools, too cruel for anything but this. As the wind shifts, the metal glints a small, sharp flash that slices across her face. She flinches as though struck. Around her, expressions tighten, not from pity, from memory. They have seen the hook before. They know how it works. They know how long it holds a body before it finally lets go. An elderly woman folds her hands at her chest. A baker wipes his palms on his apron, though he has not touched flour since the night before. A child far too young to understand, yet somehow old enough to obey, stands on tiptoe for a better view. No one questions why they are here. No one turns away. The executioner steps forward at last. He is thick-set, wrapped against the cold, but the leather straps crossing his chest creak with each movement. He does not acknowledge the girl. His attention belongs entirely to the device above her, checking the chain length, testing the beam, steadying the hook with one deliberate hand. To him, this is not cruelty. It is procedure. The girl watches him. Her breath trembles in short, shallow bursts, each cloud dissolving faster than the last. For a heartbeat, she closes her eyes not in prayer, but in resignation, as if she has finally reached the moment she could not outrun. Somewhere in the square, a church bell tolls. One long note, heavy and hollow, sinking into every spine. The hook sways again. And with that single motion, the square feels less like a public place and more like a courtroom, a stage, a trap. Whatever she has been accused of, whether true, whispered, or imagined, no longer matters. The town has come to witness what this device was built to do. But who forged it? Who conceived of a punishment meant not to kill swiftly, but to pull a body open, inch by inch, until it breaks? Who decided this was justice? And why did entire communities gather willingly, almost dutifully, to see someone lifted like meat before them? History records dates and rulers. But this moment, this cold morning, this trembling girl, this silent crowd, tells a different kind of truth. Before we go deeper, tap like if you want more forgotten history uncovered by echoes of time. And tell me where in the world you're watching from. Your perspectives shape these stories. The hook did not begin its life on a scaffold. Long before it hovered over condemned bodies, it existed in quieter places, tucked in the corners of forges, sketched in the margins of legal manuscripts, whispered about in council chambers, where punishments were designed not only to end life, but to display power. It was never a single device, no single shape, no standard model. Instead, it evolved the way cruelty often does, slowly, deliberately, refined by many hands across many years, until it became something unmistakable. In the workshops of Central Europe, blacksmiths heated lengths of iron until they glowed the color of sunset. The metal softened, pliable under the hammer's will. Each blow curved it a little more, shaping it into a crescent that was neither too sharp nor too dull. Too sharp, and death came quickly, a slice, a tear, a mercy. Too dull, and the flesh resisted, making the spectacle clumsy, unpredictable. So the craftsman found a balance. A curve that slid beneath bone, a thickness that would not bend under weight, a point that pierced just enough to hold. Some hooks bore a single barb, some had two, splitting like a serpent's tongue. Others tapered into a blunt spike, meant to burrow between ribs rather than slash through them. To the smith, these details were technical, structural. To the executioner, they were strategic. To the condemned, they were the difference between hours of agony or days of it. The townspeople knew these subtleties too, though they pretended not to. They whispered about them in taverns, reciting variations as though discussing tools of a trade. A shoulder hook for those sentenced to slow death, a rib hook for traitors, a lifting hook for punishment meant to be witnessed from the far edges of the square. The mechanism that raised the body was equally calculated. A winch carved from oak, thick rope, rough enough to burn the hands of the men who pulled it. Iron rings embedded deep into the wood so the structure would not buckle under the shifting weight of human suffering. Some cities preferred a sudden hoist, the body jerked upward in one brutal motion, leaving the crowd to gasp as bones and sinew strained against the hook. Others preferred the slow lift, the rope pulled inch by inch, the victim rising from the platform as though time itself was stretching out the inevitable. Execution records speak of the sound the body made. A dull, hollow crack when the hook found its place. A ragged exhale as the lungs strained for room. A silence afterward that was not peace but shock. Even the crowd reacted differently depending on the method. A fast lift brought murmurs. A slow one brought stillness, a terrible, reverent stillness, as though every person present could feel the weight of their own ribs, their own spine, their own fragile architecture. And through it all, the hook remained motionless, steady, cold. It was not a weapon in the way a sword was. It was not a tool in the way an axe was. It was an instrument engineered for pain, but also for message. Because the hook did not simply kill, it declared, it said, "This is what happens to those who step beyond the boundaries of order. This is what happens when the community demands fear more than mercy. This is what happens when suffering becomes a form of governance." If you're still here, if this glimpse into the machinery of punishment has you wanting to understand how such a device became law, let me know in the comments. Your reactions guide the stories we uncover on Echoes of Time. Justice, in this time and place, did not live in the hands of kings alone. It lived in ink, in the cramped handwriting of clerks who copied laws by candlelight, in parchment sealed with wax, in the cold language of statutes that carried more weight than any prayer spoken on the scaffold. The hook did not appear because a single judge demanded it. It appeared because entire councils agreed that some bodies were meant to be broken publicly. In city halls built of stone and silence, men sat around long wooden tables debating punishments with the same tone they used to discuss taxes, grain shortages, or road repairs. They did not speak of pain. They spoke of order, a theft that embarrassed a guild, a betrayal whispered behind closed doors, a crime that threatened the image of the town, even if no blood had been spilled. For each offense, there was a punishment, and for each punishment, there were parameters, written, approved, codified. This is where the hook gained legitimacy. Municipal codes described not only the use of the device, but the occasions that justified it. The language was precise, stripped of emotion, as though pain could be measured like land or grain. Some regions required the hook only for repeat offenders. Others mandated it for crimes that undermined civic harmony. Still, others applied it to anyone whose execution was meant to be a warning to travelers, merchants, and neighbors alike. And once a punishment entered the books, it became strangely familiar. It became routine. Courtrooms were small, often no larger than a merchant's home. The accused stood before a magistrate whose robes smelled faintly of wool and candle soot. Behind him sat the council, men who had never once touched a hook, but who decided, without hesitation, who would meet it. The girl on the platform, her fate had not been sealed in the square. It had been sealed here, in these quiet rooms. Trials were swift. Witnesses were inconsistent. Testimonies were shaped as much by fear as by truth. When the sentence was read aloud, it was done with the calm of a man reading a weather report or a harvest tally. Execution by hook, public, at dawn. Once the words were spoken, they traveled like an invisible draft through the entire bureaucratic machine. Clerks marked the date. Messengers notified the executioner. The council ensured the scaffold was inspected. The local tradesmen prepared the ropes, the beams, the chains, all of it logged in meticulous ledgers kept by men who would never witness the suffering their ink made possible. Even payment was systematized. The executioner received his wage. The men who assembled the platform recorded their fee. The town reimbursed itself through fines placed on the family of the condemned, as though the punishment itself were not enough. And so a device forged in fire became part of a city's paperwork. A spectacle, yes, but also a procedure, a civic duty dressed in the appearance of justice. When visitors wrote about these towns, they often described their churches, their markets, their fortifications, and their punishments. The hook was not a secret, it was not hidden. It was woven into the structure of governance, a symbol of how far a society could go when cruelty was organized instead of improvised. If you're finding this part of the story eye-opening, the way law can transform brutality into routine, hit the like button so more people can discover echoes of time. Your support helps bring these forgotten histories back into the light. Long before historians pieced together what these punishments meant, ordinary people recorded them not in scholarly treatises, but in letters, diaries, merchant journals, and the trembling recollections of travelers who found themselves standing in the wrong place on the wrong morning. Their words, preserved across centuries, carry the weight of raw human sight. One such account comes from a wandering cleric who described arriving in a small market town at dawn. He expected to find farmers setting up stalls, the scent of baking bread, the sounds of donkeys and carts. Instead, he saw a crowd gathered beneath a wooden beam, their faces turned upward in rigid silence. And then, as though the entire town inhaled at once, he watched a young man hoisted slowly off the ground, the hook entering just beneath the rib cage. The cleric wrote that the victim's scream seemed to come from the stones themselves, a sound he spent years trying to forget. Another witness, a foreign merchant, wrote of a woman condemned not for violence, but for defiance. She had spoken against a magistrate, refused to confess, refused to kneel. Her punishment was chosen not because her crime required it, but because her stubbornness insulted the council. The merchant described how she held herself like iron until the moment the hook lifted her, and only then did her body betray her, trembling wildly, fighting gravity, fighting pain, fighting the inevitability of her own surrender. In northern regions, chroniclers noted variations that shocked even seasoned observers. Some towns preferred the hook inserted through the back of the shoulder, forcing the victim to hang at a twisting angle. Others favored a lower entry point, tearing upward under the weight of the body. A few used double hooks, spaced just far enough apart to spread the chest slowly, methodically, over hours. Every method had its own philosophy. Every variation told the viewer exactly what message the authorities wanted delivered. Local records describe a man accused of passing forbidden pamphlets. His sentence included a slow lift. The winch turned one halt at a time, a single click, a pause, a murmur in the crowd, then another click, another pause. The townspeople watched as his feet left the platform by the width of a fingernail, then an inch, then a hand's breadth. Those who witnessed it later said the torture was not just in the flesh, but in the waiting. And then there were the cases preserved through accident rather than intention. A surgeon, tasked with certifying death, kept notes on the bodies he examined after such executions. He described ribs separated from cartilage, lungs partially collapsed, the spine arched in unnatural contortions. These anatomical reflections were clinical, detached yet between the lines, his revulsion leaks through. He wrote, in one quiet margin, "This is not justice, this is endurance measured by suffering." In some cities, travelers brought news of the Hook back to their homelands. Their stories differed in detail, but not in tone. A tone thick with disbelief, horror, and a sense that they had witnessed something designed not merely to kill, but to imprint itself on memory. These accounts, scattered across different regions and decades, form a mosaic of a punishment that should never have had a place in any society, yet did. A punishment that was witnessed by thousands of ordinary people who carried those images into the rest of their lives like shadows they could not shake. If this glimpse into the first-hand experiences of those who stood at the edge of these brutal scenes has struck you, tell me your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps shape the stories we bring to life here on Echoes of Time. To understand why the Hook endured, you must step beyond the scaffold and into the world that surrounded it. Because this device, brutal, intimate, undeniably cruel, did not survive on fear alone. It survived because a culture grew around it, layer by layer, until the spectacle of suffering became part of the town's identity. On execution days, the square transformed long before the condemned arrived. Merchants rolled their carts into place, unfolding cloths to display roasted nuts, warm ale, or cheap trinkets meant for restless children. Bakers opened their shutters earlier than usual, knowing that crowds meant coin. Even thieves crept through the edges of the gathering mass, slipping hands into pockets while all eyes focused on the rising platform. To the townspeople, a public execution was not simply a punishment, it was an event. Parents hoisted their children onto their shoulders under the guise of teaching them consequences. Young apprentices jostled for a better view. Traveling performers played soft tunes on lutes and flutes, not to celebrate, but to take advantage of the captive audience. Some cities even adjusted their market days to coincide with scheduled executions, ensuring the greatest number of spectators. This wasn't morbid curiosity, it was normalization. A slow blending of daily business with sanctioned brutality. Religion, too, played its part. Clergy stood beside the scaffold, reciting verses meant to frame suffering as purification, the Hook as a path to redemption, and the crowd as witnesses to divine justice. Sermons delivered the night before would speak of sin, order, and the need for spiritual cleansing, and although they did not name the condemned, everyone understood the message. These rituals made the execution feel sanctioned not only by law, but by heaven. If the church permitted it, how could anyone question it? Political leaders understood the power of this framing. The Hook was not merely a punishment, it was a tool of control. The slower the death, the clearer the message. Defy us, and your body becomes the warning. In cities troubled by rebellion, dissent, or unrest, the Hook was used more often. Not because crimes were worse there, but because fear was more valuable. The slow, visible agony reinforced the authority of those in power. Each execution became a performance staged for the living rather than a consequence meant for the dead. Even the executioner benefited from this culture. Though shunned socially, he earned more from these tortures than from simple hangings. He received payment for preparation, for specialized skill, for the hours spent overseeing the slow decline of the condemned. Some executioners kept ledgers of each event, lists of fees, dates, names, transforming suffering into accounting. Every component of the spectacle had a purpose. Every role served the system. Every whispered gasp, every fearful child, every coin exchanged beneath the scaffold fed into a culture that made the Hook not only acceptable, but expected. And so the device remained. Not because people were monsters, but because they believed they were participating in order, morality, and communal stability, unaware or unwilling to admit that each scream echoed far beyond the square. If this deeper look into how society shaped and was shaped by this gruesome ritual has captivated you, consider subscribing to Echoes of Time. Exploring how cultures normalize cruelty helps us understand far more than the past. For centuries, the hook hung over Europe like a shadow, a quiet threat woven into the rhythms of daily life. But shadows shift, and even the most entrenched cruelties eventually meet the pressure of ideas powerful enough to crack them. Its decline did not begin with a single ruler or a single law. It began with doubt. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, whispers began to spread through universities, courts, and taverns. What if pain was not justice? What if public punishment did not purify society but hardened it? What if the spectacle of suffering did not prevent crime but taught people to tolerate it? The Enlightenment did not arrive like a sunrise. It arrived like a slow, unsettling question that people could no longer ignore. In legal circles, reformers argued that torture clouded truth rather than revealing it. Scholars dissected old legal codes with the precision of surgeons, exposing contradictions and moral failures. Judges began to reconsider whether public agony really upheld order or simply entertained the masses under the guise of law. Some rulers took these doubts personally. A few, known for their severity, clung to the old methods. But others, cautious, pragmatic, or subtly influenced by philosophers, stepped away from the hook, one decree at a time. City councils quietly removed it from their penal lists. Magistrates began choosing alternate sentences, preferring imprisonment or swift execution over prolonged suffering. Clergymen, once staunch supporters of public punishment, found themselves speaking of mercy more often than fire and brimstone. In some regions, the device was not banned with grand ceremony. It simply stopped being repaired, stopped being ordered, stopped being used. The iron rusted, the beams decayed, and eventually, a punishment that had once drawn crowds large enough to choke a city square disappeared, without anyone marking the exact day it ended. But ending a practice does not erase its memory. The hook lingers in the margins of legal records, in the quiet horror of old journals, in the museum collections where a few surviving examples sit behind glass, silent, motionless, stripped of purpose, yet still heavy with meaning. It reveals something uncomfortable about us, that cruelty does not require monsters. It requires systems, routines, communities willing to watch, and authorities willing to write suffering into the fabric of law. When the hook vanished, it was not just torture that ended, it was a worldview, a belief in fear as governance, a belief in pain as order, a belief that the body could be made into a warning for the collective. The world stepped away from the scaffold not because it had grown kinder all at once, but because enough voices, enough doubts, enough small acts of resistance finally pulled history in a different direction. And yet, what remains is a question that echoes long after the final hook was taken down. If a society could normalize this, what else could it come to accept? If this journey through the rise and fall of the hook has left you thinking about the ways power shapes justice, consider joining the Echoes of Time community. Like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Together, we keep the lessons of the past alive.